Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. History, Porter Swentzell says, is mud. Alicia, Diego, and Christian look at adobe architecture's shared traits across cultures from New Mexico to North Africa, while analyzing how, in Santa Fe, this medium has been appropriated over the last century for tourist ends. This episode of Unsettled digs into the ways that local indigenous and mixed indigenous communities have revived ancestral adobe making practices to restore a connection to place. This is episode 5, part 6, titled Mud.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Now you're talking sense.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here feel like a new wave. Third eye open wide, no flow ride, I decalcify, open up them lotus petals.
Well, I arrived at it through my grandmother. My grandmother, Josefa Sandoval, was a brickmaker, an adobe brickmaker in New Mexico, and her and my family, she raised her 7 children as a single mother because my grandfather was often away. He was a sheep herder in Utah. And so he was often away most of the year doing that work, and then would come back to the family in New Mexico for harvest. So the bulk of the labor on the land fell to my grandmother and the kids, and that, including my mother. And so they would make bricks for the local construction companies, and they just make it on the land where they were and with what they had. And they were also harvesting hay and had several types of food crops that they would harvest and sell also to the local grocers. And so it was a kind of an ecosystem that's built into my family, although they've the kids, the next generation that she raised, really don't have those practices anymore. They really moved away from that connection with the land. And I really wanted to, as a sculptor, as somebody who is really interested in material, and with issues of land and habitation, it was an obvious opportunity for me to be able to work with this material, but not as a brickmaker, as a casting material, and to think about a much longer history of adobe and thinking about it as a material that connects and binds all desert people throughout the world.
In a way, this is how Christine Howard Sandoval and I came together back in 2016, through the women in our family and their relationship to land. Her grandmother Josefa made adobe bricks for a living in El Llanito, a village now swallowed up by the ever-expanding traffic jam that is Bernalillo. My great-grandmother Juanita was an enjarradora, or mud plasterer, whose family was originally from Chimayo. I grew up in the adobe house that my great-grandmother replastered every year with the help of the family, including my mom. In the 1960s, the adobe exterior was covered in a thick layer of mud-colored stucco. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but cracks have now formed where water has seeped in and pulled the two substrates apart. Someone in my family, probably an uncle, filled in those cracks with cement, creating what now look like gray tributaries traveling up the facade of the building. Inside, the 2 feet thick walls appear as sturdy as ever. One day I told Christine she could visit this adobe house. Christine, who grew up in the Bay Area, is an interdisciplinary artist who identifies with her Obispeño Chumash ancestry and as Hispanic. When we met, she was a resident at Santa Fe Art Institute's Water Rights Residency and attempting to reconnect with her New Mexico lineage. Her mom had left El Llanito at age 16, and when Christine decided to return to her mother's homeland and eventually get her mom to return too, She had to geomap the journey back because the area surrounding El Llanito had changed so much.
To use technology to place her digitally into El Llanito was really interesting, and we would locate through geomapping where she grew up, and it was I feel like it was a really interesting tool to get her thinking about the possibility of going back physically, and it really helped kind of ignite certain memories that she had never told me. Um, and so slowly over the course of several months, we kind of arrived at her coming to Yanito and us going there together. And so that just opened up a whole project, not just about her and her history to water and agricultural practices and labor and coming from a farming family, but also the larger implications for all of those cultural practices and existences and economies in New Mexico that are related to the acequias.
As part of the residency, which was in some ways about coming home, Christine built an entire canal out of adobe. There was video and audio too, each one a component of a larger artwork called Channel, a meditation on the function that water and land have played in Manito and native agrarian communities. Afterward, Christine continued to work with adobe, creating beautiful drawings striated with mud.
Well, now I'm working with Adobe in a climate that absolutely is not conducive to Adobe because it's it's a temperate rainforest where I am. And Adobe is all about the desert and the sun and the dryness and the content of clay within the soil. So I think it's in some sense it's really funny that I'm insisting on working with Adobe here because that's a practice that I am still so invested in right now. Um, and so what I'm doing right now is actively making plans for when we can travel again, to go back home and work in California, and start bringing some people and maybe some collaboration if that happens into this work. It still has meaning and there's still more things that I'm learning. That's the thing is like when I'm working with this material, whether it's material that I'm harvesting from my backyard and hand mixing with clays and sand and like, putting together my own form of adobe, or working in desert regions and working with land that is meant to be adobe. They're so that like the physical labor involved with making that work and using that material is so gratifying. Mixing the material, harvesting it, laying it down, like the kind of pain that I feel at the end of the day of having like a work session, um, is so I am so not ready to not work with Adobe. It's like there's still so much to be learned from this material and this way of working that it feels almost endless. It's when I started working with Adobe, it was like, oh, I think I found my material. I think this is it. Like this is gonna take me into uh, a long, long way into the future right now. And it's like I've been doing it since 2016, which actually is not that long of time. It's only 5 years, but I'm by no means like ready to put it down, even though I'm living in a climate that is not a desert region. I'm still thinking through this material.
For Christine, who now lives and works in Vancouver as an assistant professor of interdisciplinary art at Emily Carr University, Adobe is now part of her. It connects her to New Mexico and, as she says, to all desert people who've ever made a sun-baked brick. But here, like everything else, adobe is complicated. History is mud, Porter Swentzell told us, and the people of New Mexico are like concrete, Jason Garcia said. Well, when we get down to it, adobe is equally messy. It blurs boundaries, tells of places near and far, and carries in it a long history of labor, both voluntary and forced. As a building material, adobe is ubiquitous, punctuating our high desert landscape as much as sagebrush. It marks the passage of time in the form of ruins lining roadways and in the multi-generational buildings that our families and communities maintain still. In New Mexico, adobes have been used to build everything from hornos or outdoor ovens to mission churches and even a mosque. In this episode of Unsettled, we not only trace these forms, but also spend time digging into the history of adobe, from its origins here in the Americas to the ways in which new architectural techniques that have roots in North Africa were brought to the Southwest with colonization and in later waves. We also talk about how adobe and Pueblo style and Pueblo revival architecture, which we'll get into later, have become a signature of the Southwest. Here, adobe is packaged, commodified, and sold as part of a larger romantic vision. Now, we can't think about adobe without also thinking about gentrification.
And so essentially, there was a group of Muslims that wanted to start an intentional community and got money from a princess from Saudi Arabia and bought land in Abiquiu. And they wanted to build a school and madrasa is what we call it, which has obviously really hard connotations now post September 11th, but it just literally means school, and a mosque and community. And so they bought this really beautiful piece of land, and um, this Egyptian architect who's actually a Nobel Prize winner, Hassan Fatih. You might have heard of him. He's famous for architecture for the poor and building this is what it's called. That's what they call it, and building in this style that's Nubian. It's from Upper Egypt or the Said, and so he designed the mosque that's in Abiquiu, and he came out to New Mexico and they built it, and all of these kind of builders came with him from Upper Egypt, from the Said, and then all of these local, New Mexicans from Abiquiu and around also worked on it because it's a huge building. It, for a while, was the largest adobe building in North America, I think. I don't know if it still is, but so it was like adobe's, obviously been used here for so long, and then its origins are, even the word adobe is actually Arabic, the etymology of it. And so it was this kind of wedding of cultures, of building cultures, and they built the mosque and madrasa. So yeah, adobe in Arabic is atub. So like if you describe an adobe house, you'd say like a bit atobi, which became adobe, which is sort of interesting. So my parents ended up in New Mexico because my dad is a master carpenter, and they knew some of the people that were founding this community, and they needed a carpenter to do all of the woodwork on the mosque and madrasa. So they moved to the States to be a part of the community and help build the mosque.
At a latitude of 36 degrees north, Abiquiu is in the same zone as Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Syria, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Our arid landscapes are mirrors to one another, even if separated by thousands of miles. Fatima van Hatum, whose parents arrived in Abiquiu in those early years as converts to Islam and members of the intentional community at Dar al-Islam, said that this similarity determined the choice of location overlooking the Chama River.
I think what drew them was the land, and the I think it was just the beauty of it, the landscape, and and also a lot of people, they come to Abiquiu and they're like, oh my god, this reminds me of Iran, this reminds me of Afghanistan. Like people have such, it's interesting. I feel like northern New Mexico especially, like people see other places in it too. um
but that, I think is what first drew folks. And my parents, even after the madrasa and the kind of community in its original form ended, my parents stayed because of that. They had fallen in love with this place, and I think it's just become an integral part of, say, my own spiritual identity, just kind of growing up. And in our spiritual practice, like we follow the lunar calendar for our spiritual calendar, and things are really rooted in cycles. And like our book, the Quran, talks a lot about cycles and different things in nature. And so growing up in that context where, not in say a city or something where we really could follow the cycles of the moon and be really rooted in that, and just the changes, and just be more, I guess, aligned with what's land based, I think really shaped my spiritual practice. And it's just the earth and the elemental aspect of it, and the way I think, just even my way of knowing, my epistemology was for sure shaped by this like rural land based kind of thinking.
Hassan Fatin was probably best known for his involvement in the construction of New Gorna. Located on Luxor's west bank, the community was created to resettle tomb robbers who'd been looting the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. When he began building in New Mexico in 1980, Fatih, along with 2 Egyptian masons, offered workshops to local folks in Abiquiu, as well as to people across the state and even Mexico on how to build Nubian-style adobe domes. There were the pendentives, domes placed on square bases, and barrel vaults, each of which looked like oversized accordions stretched in the shape of an arch. Hagia Sophia, or the Holy Grand Mosque, located in Istanbul, is probably the best example of pendentive architecture. Designed by Greek architects in 532, it was the largest structure to make use of domes placed on square bases. Because of the construction at Dar al-Islam, we now have our own version of that technology here in New Mexico. And in the years after it was built, pendentives started popping up all over the place. There's one just off the highway in Tusuke, where fry bread used to be sold. Oriented in the direction of Mecca, Dar al-Islam is located on a mesa that overlooks the pueblo of Abiquiu. Inside, light filters through triangle cutouts in the adobe and casts shapes onto the bone-white walls. Diego, Christian, and I were able to make a visit. Being inside feels like this mix of the faraway and the nearby. Talavera tile covers the floors, and in one room, vigas and latias line the ceiling. In another, the ceiling was left unplastered, allowing us to see the tight alignment of adobe bricks spiraling in the form of a dome. Christian pointed out that it looks similar to the inside of an horno, which, by the way, was a North African technology brought to the Iberian Peninsula and then brought to our arid environment. We wouldn't have horno bread without it. To Fatima, who grew up in Abiquiu attending Abiquiu Elementary after the school at Dar al-Islam closed when she was in kindergarten, the mosque and the entire project bridged a parallel history of people much less often spoken about here: the presence of Muslims in the Americas, including the Moors.
Yeah, it's really profound, especially, later. I think like there's this consciousness of that connection between, the Moors and the Muslims in Spain, who are in Spain for longer than the United States has existed in its current form as a nation state. So, there's like a profound influence there. And then, with the Reconquista and folks kind of coming to the Americas, like you see that you can trace that a bit, just all the words in Spanish that have Arabic origins, or the architecture, or acequias and the waterways and all of these things. So there's like this consciousness that it's really interesting that's there. And then this was like this more over, kind of like this really particular North African architectural style, but then built in adobe, which is like from there, but also from here, and I don't know, I would need to ask my dad like how many people came, but they're really incredible photographs of just kind of locals, and then Saidi guys all learning how to build or building together, because it's a specific style of building. But I do know that there were, when they built the domes, which are really specific, when you build them with adobe, it's like almost like a spiral the way they're built, and there's a lot of tension and pressure that has to be very exact. And when they built the vaults and the domes, I think a lot of people came from all over to learn how to do that, because even though we use, and adobe's been used here for so long, the dome is less common, as an architectural feature. um, so I know that that was like drew people from all over New Mexico to learn how to build domes from these like incredible builders from Egypt that were here. So it is a really special and unique moment, in history. And I think like it also just speaks to the fact that, Islam and Muslim history in America is usually framed as really like exogenous and external to American history. But, we know that so many, and in some states like the Carolinas, up to 70% of enslaved Africans were Muslim. And so we know that as long as Europeans, and then, you probably know about Estebanico Mustafa. Well, he's called in popular culture. Yeah. So, I mean, he was here in New Mexico. As long as, Europeans have been colonizing, unfortunately, they've also been kind of like enslaving Muslims and bringing them here, So there's this sort of other history that we're not really taught, which I know for me as a Muslim here, it was profound to learn about it, and just really understand the legacy.
Estevanico, for those who don't know, was a North African Berber who spoke Arabic. He was enslaved in 1522 by a Spanish businessman and brought to the Americas to help establish the colony of Florida. His story is long and complicated. There was a shipwreck involved, but he eventually ended up in New Mexico with Cabeza de Vaca, who wrote about their travels in a memoir called The Relacion. In it, Estevanico, whose actual name was Mustafa Azamori, was referred to as the Black, and he usually went ahead of the party in the form of a scout. When he disappeared sometime in 1539, the Spaniard he was with blamed the people of Zuni for his death. Today, his death has yet to be resolved.
But, his story is really interesting. Estebanico, he was quote unquote a Moor, right? So North African, and the depictions of him, are either as brown or black, and yeah, he was Muslim, and I think that's also just not necessarily as discussed. There is a great book by Leila Lalami, and it's a sort of a fictional historical fiction about him and just about the whole journey, because he was a slave, and I guess came, I think, with Cabeza de Vaca to first to Florida and then up through Mexico to New Mexico. And he was this really like, again, with the hybridity of identities, he had this really interesting position, because he was a slave, but he also, it kind of throughout, there were these moments where he had more of an affinity with um, different tribes and indigenous groups, because he occupied this more like in between liminal space. And because he wasn't white and he wasn't, of the colonizers, but he was with them. So it's just this sort of interesting. And I think there's more to it, definitely. Like you're saying, it's this, he's flattened and the story's more complicated, I think, than we know, probably. But there's also a few other great books. There's Servants of Allah, which is by Sylvia Diouf, which is a phenomenal book. It's Servants of Allah, Africans enslaved in the Americas, and African Muslims enslaved in the Americas, and it basically traces the whole history and ship records and logs, and these, they're actually primary source documents, that are where enslaved peoples wrote in the margins of the Bible, and a lot of them spoke Arabic. And so they wrote there. We actually have slave narratives that are written. And and then there's like African Muslims in the antebellum South. There are a few really, really powerful books, and more scholarship about this topic. So it's unfortunate, of course, that this isn't what we're being taught, right?
There's a Sadia Hartman quote on Christine's Instagram page that says it all. The loss of stories sharpens the hunger for them. While Christine began working with Adobe to reconnect with her grandmother in New Mexico, She realized that on her mother's side, the history of building with adobe was much more fraught. To this day, it remains like the stories of enslaved Muslims throughout the Americas, untaught, even if presenced, as Christine says, within the material of adobe itself.
In my father's side, what it means is slave labor in the missions in California. And looking at when you see an adobe facade with an archway, what that means as a form in space, as a material, um, is all kind of deeply ingrained in our psychology. From even me growing up in the Bay Area, looking at the way that we were educated in the public school system about what missionization is and did as a system, you know, always looking at it as a past, but it's very much in the present. And a lot of the ways that it presences itself is through the material, actually. And also equally commodified, as you're saying, with, you know, very rich people who are building their houses who want that Spanish mission look, and they want to copy some of those architectural typologies and repeat them in the landscape without looking at what they signify for people.
Land speaks to us, adobe speaks to us. Both are archives of a sort where what is manifest or on the surface doesn't quite reveal what's below. But those latent stories exist. We just have to speak their language.
Yeah, and it's also very tied to the land and the way that the land was changed at like completely within one generation in California, actually. I mean, so it's like I was saying, the ecosystem of food, um, in the introduction of invasive species and slave labor and the genocide of indigenous people are all a part of that ecology of contact. And I mean, right now, the research that I'm doing is it's so entangled and messy right now that I'm just trying to figure out how to tell the multiple strands of this story. But one of the so I have ancestors in who were in Mission Soledad in Southern California, and then I in the Mission San Luis Obispo, which is in San Luis Obispo, um, and they were related and migrating. People were migrating um, between the different missions because of marriage, interracial marriage, and because people were being moved by being married into um, a Spanish a Spanish marriage or something like that, and so they would be taken to different missions, or a mission might fall to um, robbers and people who were coming and wreaking havoc on the mission and the ranches. So it was over the course of the 18th and 19th century, and what happened was that, in a nutshell, was that the father Junipero Serra, who was the main architect really of this just this genocide, alongside a corps of army troops, that he was like the religious person, but he was flanked by an army of people who were enforcing in a very violent way uh, indigenous tribes, and there are many indigenous tribes in California, to move onto the areas that they were constructing for the missions. And what was happening is that they would put indigenous people to labor immediately to start building these missions out of adobe, which was a practice that was coming out of Spain. It wasn't a practice that was not a practice of architecture for Chumash people. So Chumash architecture revolves around the grasslands on the coast, and making the app, which is the word for the house that is made out of grass and is in the form of a dome, and is using both willow and red willow and different types of willow to make the structure, and then different types of grasses to make the walls that are thatched together. And there are different modes and different purposes for different types of houses, but then also there are ceremonial houses that are used for inipi and other types of practices, but they weren't using adobe. And so use this form of architecture, and brick making was very much a product of colonization. And so they started to do that. They also they were forced to start trying to grow things through seeds that were brought from the ships from overseas. And what that did was start these kind of mono crops. And it was a way of tending the land that was absolutely opposite to the ethos that Chumash people were practicing, which involved like pretty heavy maintenance of wildlands before contact. And so having these farmlands, and even just the practice of farming and agriculture, was also a product of colonization. So these neat lines and these rows of things that you're growing was not in the language of the way that Chumash people relate to the land and to growing things.
It was uncommon for coastal populations to work with adobe, and doing so in California to build the missions actually shifted the entire ecology of the landscape. That process also cut off migrations and ruptured ways of being in relation. And it all comes back to Junipero Serra, who we mentioned in the very first episode, an 18th century Spanish Franciscan missionary who came to the Americas from Majorca. Canonized as a saint by Pope Francis in 2015 to massive protests by indigenous peoples and great church support, he founded 21 California missions in what was then known to the Spanish Empire as Alta California. Serra was only able to build and maintain those missions by brutalizing and enslaving native populations, Christine's relatives, and prohibiting them from leaving the mission's grounds. Last summer, with the wave of monuments to colonization and imperialism's greatest enforcers coming down like dominoes, it was no surprise that statues of Serra were among the toppled and spray painted. San Francisco's Golden Gate Park was just one site where Serra's likeness was left covered in red paint and prone on the ground. Now remains the work of healing the trauma left in his wake.
One thing is, it's more confusing and complicated than ever. Then the more work we do, the more complicated it is. But the feeling in my heart is one of deep relationship with my parents right now. I mean, I grew up with not the best family life, and I won't get into a lot of those details, but it's taken a long time to have this conversation. So there are reasons why I'm coming to uncovering some of these truths with my family members now, and with my aunties and my cousins and cousins I didn't even know I had, is making me feel, on the one hand, much more strength of who I am. And it is absolutely about healing these traumas that I've been living with for, since childhood. And I think about it, especially in relationship to my son. Um, and, I have a son who is 6 years old. His name is Izel. And how a lot of those things just immediately get transferred. A lot of those traumas get transferred through parenting and through the things that we teach. And he's been exposed to the Inipi in the sense where he like sits outside of Sweat Lodge and listens to drumming and listens to song, but we're not immersed in traditional practices because we're still finding our way back to those relationships. Um, I am just starting to make my way back to the kind of cultural practices and relationships that my aunts and uncles had in Bakersfield, where they had a Chumash cultural center and were practicing and meeting and having community there that I never even knew about. You know, my family, because of violence and trauma, have really separated and have spread out. So we are coming back together in, and I say that also coming back together, not to over, you know, idealize what that means, but it's a slow, very slow and precarious and emotional process that is not always enjoyable. So yeah, I mean, I think that it brings a sense of kind of a larger intention that I have in being an artist. And I always say that there's like the front facing work that I do in the art world that has that addresses an audience that is um often very westernized and very capitalistic. But then there's this other work that I do that is very personal, that is not for consumption, and it is aesthetic, it's poetic, it's emotional, it's historical, it's archival, and it's about building those relationships. So it's like how close are those projects going to get to each other? I don't really know, but my I mean, it's the reason why I even live here in Vancouver is because I have a, several year intention of getting back home and working more directly with traditional practices. That's really what I'm putting out there in the world, is that I want to be back home. I want to be learning language. I want to have those connections. I am making them from afar. That's not good enough. I need to be physically closer.
In New Mexico, adobe had been used by indigenous builders for centuries and centuries. Take the example of Taos Pueblo, a multi story complex made entirely out of earth mixed with straw and water, materials of this place. It was built 1,000 years ago and remains to this day. While many buildings of this era used a form of construction we now call puddled adobe, brick forms like the ones brought with the Spanish were also made. With the entrance of the Spanish, adobe building only grew in scope, as they created communities built from adobe that were oriented around a central plaza and church, also built from adobe. This design is still imprinted in many of our communities, both native and Manito. In some cases, these structures were also built with enslaved indigenous labor, as in the construction of the city of Santa Fe. But what all these buildings share in common, even when taking into account their origins, is a certain feeling of being surrounded by earth. Adobe structures have their own microclimate, breath, and spirit. Adobe, Diego says, is another ancestor. According to recent data, 1 in 3 people globally live in a home made of earth.
It's something, that it's really common, like in Africa, in the Middle East, and China, and here, and in Mexico, and throughout Latin America. It's like Earth is, it's below us. And what's been kind of beautiful is like building earth and homes and living within them. And then that's also like after we die, we go back into the earth. It's like interesting thinking about like living in it and making a home within it. And then when we pass away, that's where we're also like held, being held like while we're living. And then when we die, we like go back into it.
Joanna Keane Lopez is an artist in Adovera who began building with Adobe, like Christine, as a means of reconnecting with her family history and a sense of place. A multi-generational Nuevo Mexicana on her father's side and Irish on her mother's, Joanna grew up in Albuquerque in barrios of the South Valley, the North Valley, and even Old Town. Her father's family, the Lopez line, traces its roots back to Socorro.
I guess one of the reasons why I was specifically one of the reasons why I was specifically drawn towards learning about Adobe architecture was a yearning to connect more fully with my own history here in New Mexico and with my father's family, the Lopezes, and connecting to like a sense of place and family and community and history. And so my father's family, we have an old land grant in Socorro called Lopezville that dates back to, like around maybe 1910. And we have like a few different adobe houses that are there that were built by either my great-grandfather Abelino or my great-great-grandfather Rafael Lopez y Luna, and the family, that was there. And so as of now, most of the houses are all abandoned and like in disarray, and a lot of the family has like fallen apart and is either like has died or is incarcerated, or people are estranged from one another. And you can see it in the houses and in the adobe houses and the land, and it's like a direct reflection of the strength of the family and the necessity of having like an adobe home, which is like a natural home, and it requires a relationship and a maintenance. And if the family or even the community, has begun to like fall apart or have more fragmentation or multi-generational trauma, it's a direct reflection into this home that's also so related to like a natural material and the land.
When Joanna started studying the material, she apprenticed with other adoberas, including Carol Cruz, Helen Levine, owner of New Mexico Earth Adobe, and Anita Rodriguez, who herself went to Egypt to study with Hassan Fatih. Anita's house and house incorporates one of those pendentive domes I was just talking about. Today, building a home from adobe is expensive because of the labor involved. But prior to the annexation of New Mexico by the United States, 97% of all homes were built with mud. Now that number is closer to 10%. To put it into perspective, the majority of adobe bricks made in the last 3 decades have been made for large-scale, expensive homes throughout the state. Yet adobe wasn't always coveted by those moving to this area from elsewhere. During the territorial period, Americans tried all sorts of ways to disguise adobe buildings, going so far in some cases to cover facades with a cement coating, and then painting them to resemble masonry. Porter talks all about this in episode 2. The gist of it? The architecture was too brown, just like the people, and like the people, it needed to be rehabilitated. But once tourism boosters realized that this vernacular architecture was actually a draw, they stopped poo-pooing it and created new plans for historic preservation. That process has led to the steady and downward spiral of outsiders deciding how to value our homes and the rest of us trying to keep up. By 1957, preservationists grasping at this now valued style and trying to trap it in amber created a historic district. Any changes to buildings within had to be approved by a heavy handed design board, with all sorts of opinions about authenticity. That board still exists today and is responsible in part for creating the conditions under which gentrification could and has taken place. Now, those who remain in Santa Fe's historic east side are mostly wealthy and white. At the same time, Pueblo and Manito communities elsewhere saw in stucco a nice look-alike version of adobe, a material that was much less time consuming when it came to upkeep. Rather than replastering a house every single year, stucco offered a handy alternative, especially as folks began to enter a new money economy.
And yeah, and then in the 50s, it became really common to like throw up chicken wire and like, yeah, stucco it, you know? But then that allows, if there's any type of cracks, then water is able to get in. And instead of the adobe bricks like breathing, which is what they usually do, they like swell a little bit with like the water, like humidity, and then they dry out again. So there's kind of this almost like a breathing to like the adobe walls. But when you put like stucco on it, it basically gets trapped, and the moisture can, if moisture gets in, it gets trapped in there, and then it can just basically what can happen is it begins to melt away and inside, so it's almost like it just becomes a shell in between like stucco, and so that's something that can happen. And so it's almost interesting to think about these like old adobe houses that were then stuccoed, and now they're all the mud inside. I mean, assuming it wasn't stabilized in any way, just kind of melted away, and now it's like a shell of a house, which is almost like an interesting metaphor. There's about, just at least on our road, because there's other like cousins and stuff who are on another road. There's one, two, three, four. There's about 5 houses, and on specifically, it's on the corner of Lopezville and Lopezville. The 2 oldest houses on my road, at least, are like old adobe houses, and then one of them's like halfway like an adobe, and then also like a cinder block. It's like cinder block and adobe, and that was the next one that was built. And then the other one that was built further down, maybe in like the 70s, was like all just like wood frame. And so like as time went on, it was more and more like the family like built less and less with adobe architecture, you know, and more towards like, an idea of modernization.
Joanna, whose father recently passed on an adobe house to her in Socorro, now offers workshops on how to build with the material. Many of the attendees are multi generational Nuevo Mexicanos like herself, making their way back to the land through building. It's a common refrain. Even the Pueblo Boquiawenge Housing Authority began rebuilding their adobe plaza as much of it had fallen into disrepair, not only as a result of the prevalence of stucco, but also the entrance of newer HUD housing that emptied out the Pueblo center.
It's like an interesting mix between people who are, they're locals, or their families are from here and they have history with adobe, and they want to learn because it's sort of like like a returning back to family memory. And then I have other people who maybe don't have that type of like heritage or family roots to adobe architecture, but they have like a very true and sincere interest in the practice, and also like a thoughtfulness to it. And I guess one thing that I do like, I am concerned about, because of the amount of people moving to New Mexico from out of state, and like the history of like gentrification and tokenization. And it's like I do worry, and I do wonder like about offering this traditional vernacular architectural skills and techniques, and hoping that like I guess that I need to be you know um open and thoughtful enough with like my words to express like the intimacy of like adobe architecture as like a building knowledge that is like very, very unique to this area. And I think that I just I definitely don't want it to be used in like a tokenized like way that can be like increased gentrification by, having it taught more to like maybe I definitely want it to be taught more to people here who are really interested in keeping it real and versus like someone who might want to like take it back to like Los Angeles and make money from it on their own gain. And so it's intense, but it's like, you teach people and you show people and you don't know necessarily where it's going to go from there.
We are currently grappling with another wave of settlerism and what's being hailed as the Zoom boom, the migration of telecommuters now coming to Santa Fe and parts of New Mexico to work well remotely. Throughout New Mexico, real estate has gone up 10% during the pandemic, pushing the median sales price to around $240,000 per home. In Santa Fe, real estate has gone up by 20%. The median sales price here, $537,000. And we know why. Santa Fe is a mid-sized town rich in amenities and rich in romance. Even Target and IHOP have followed the mandate to create faux Pueblo-style architecture. At the same time, many of our own homes are no longer adobe, and if they are, they have already been covered in stucco, slowly becoming shells. And while Joanna wants to return to the adobe house her father Damasio Lopez passed on to her, again, it's complicated.
It's funny because my father recently passed on to me his house that's there, and it's one of the older adobe houses. It's just like a small casita, and it's super funky. And a friend of mine came out and was like, "Oh, maybe you could build your own like little house out here with like the land and the dirt here." And because there's some land that I could do that. But there's also the reality that a lot of the land in New Mexico has been polluted. In Socorro, the mining college is out there, and my father he worked as an activist against depleted uranium for most of his life. And the college in the 70s and 60s, they used to test uranium like bombs that had uranium in it in the mountains. And our property, it kind of like, it's not right up against the mountains, but it's open space to the mountains. And it's, my father has told me a lot that like Socorro's, it's radiated or a lot of it has low level radiation in it. And also, the Trinity site, as a crow flies, I guess, is like about like 30 miles away or something. And so it's interesting to think about like, and it's, building, for me to like build and maybe possibly like an adobe house with like the dirt that's already on the property, and then having this feeling that it's been tainted by the test bombs that have happened out there, because that stuff, has like a half-life of like 1 billion years or something. And so that's like, it's even especially on native land, it's even, more prominent, or, even closer to possibly like the test site around White Sands. And so, it's interesting to think like, okay, like, yeah, let's build with, ancestral land. Let's build with the land right here. But then it's like, well, what's the history around here? Like, what has happened here? They've, it's a history. I think one thing that a lot of people don't know moving here and really interested in New Mexico and the culture and the Georgia O'Keeffe stuff, and they don't realize that New Mexico has been like a sacrificial state for like uranium mining and testing, and that there's a lot of history here, and it is in the land.
Now you're talking sense. Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tilt Unsettled. This episode was produced by Alicia with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
I'm reaching holy water. Yeah, bump in the trunk. Third eye opened up.